The Dark Scrolls. It is said that the earth itself remembers screams, long after flesh has dissolved into loam and the names of kings have faded to dust. The dirt keeps the echo of that last exhale, the hopeless gasp before the darkness swallows everything. There is a clearing deep within the forests of Van Lang, where no birds dare nest, where the moss grows in the shape of contorted hands clawing toward the sky. Old women who gather firewood in those parts swear that, if you press your ear to the ground at dusk, you can hear the buried sobbing in a language older than any kingdom. In the final days of the reign of the 15th Hong King, the air over the citadel thickened with the stench of illness and inevitability. The king's body, bloated and mottled with decay, though his breath still rasped in his throat, was kept hidden behind layers of embroidered drapery. The court physicians whispered among themselves, though they no longer dared to approach the corpse that had not yet accepted it was dead. Beyond the high walls, the people squinted anxiously at the peaks of black smoke that coiled into the sky like omens. All knew that when the king's soul slipped loose, no simple funeral pyre would suffice. The passing of a god-king demanded a tribute no mortal could measure in gold alone. The High Oracle, whose teeth were stained red from the roots she chewed to commune with spirits, announces that the king must be escorted into the afterlife by 108 living vessels. 108 men and women bound in service, sealed in earth to walk beside the king's spirit as eternal attendants. This decree fluttered through the corridors of the palace on scraps of parchment, more terrible than any war edict. Soldiers laid trembling hands on the shoulders of the selected. Girls no older than 12 were pulled screaming from the weaving halls. Seasoned warriors wept as they kissed their children for the last time. All night, the chosen were confined to a vast hall lit by the pale, quivering glow of tallow candles. Some knelt in silent resignation, eyes blank, their minds already detached from the agony to come. Others clawed at the doors until their fingernails split and left smears of blood on the carved panels. The scent of sweat and despair collected beneath the ceiling beams, as heavy as the damp season's heat. Every so often, the High Oracle would glide between them, trailing a robe of cracked bone beads that hissed softly against the floor. She never spoke to them directly. She only pressed a thumb dipped in cinnabar to each forehead, marking them as vessels unworthy of burial in the light. At dawn, the gongs sounded. The hall doors creaked open. A procession of priests filed in, faces masked by lacquered visages of monstrous deities whose names no longer survived in the language of the living. Their footsteps were measured, their chants low and droning. The captives were driven in a single file toward the burial field outside the eastern gate, their wrists bound with ropes dyed the color of old wounds. Every step toward the field was an unraveling of whatever hope remained in their chests. Some stumbled and were dragged by the guards. Some began to sing lullabies through cracked lips, the melodies dissolving into sobs. The burial field had been prepared for weeks. 36 pits had been dug, each so deep that when a man was lowered in, only the top of his shaven skull remained visible. Along the rims, baskets of fine white clay waited to be poured in after the bodies, sealing them in an airtight embrace. The priests said this would purify their flesh, preventing decay, preserving their spirits so they could serve the king forever in his palace beneath the mountain. A hush fell over the gathered crowd, courtiers, soldiers, merchants, all assembled to witness the sovereign's final passage. Children were forbidden to watch, but many peered between the legs of their elders, wide-eyed and pale. They would carry this sight inside them for as long as they drew breath. The oracle raised her staff, its tip crowned with a bleached human jaw. At her signal, the first group was led to the nearest pit. 6 women, hair shorn to stubble, bodies trembling in thin funeral robes. Their eyes were black wells of disbelief. One of them began to retch when she saw the pit yawning before her, but no vomit came, only thin strings of bile. The guards took her by the elbows and half-carried her to the edge. She tried to lock her knees to force them not to bend, but her strength had fled hours ago. With a final shuddering moan, she slid down into the darkness. The others followed in slow succession. Some had to be beaten until they ceased struggling. Others climbed down on their own, as if this submission was the only scrap of dignity they could salvage. When all 6 were arranged in the pit, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the cold mud, the priests began to chant. The words were meaningless syllables, a string of incantations that droned like the buzzing of flies. Clay was poured first, spooned in by dozens of silent acolytes. The captives gasped as the cold slurry soaked their legs, then their hips. One woman tilted her head back and began to shriek, a thin wail that pierced the clouds. A priest struck her across the mouth with a wooden paddle, and the sound stopped. The clay rose higher, thick and white as curdled milk, engulfing torsos, necks. Eyes bulged, teeth clenched. The mud climbed inexorable. As the last inches closed over their faces, a few heads jerked violently, spasming in mute horror. When all movement ceased, the priests smoothed the surface flat, like a potter finishing the lid of a jar. From above, it was as if no living creatures had ever been entombed there, only a pale, unbroken skin of clay gleaming under the wan dawn. And this was only the beginning. 30 more pits waited, and the oracle's staff did not waver. Row by row, the condemned were driven to their graves. The youngest, a boy with a birthmark across his cheek, tried to plead for mercy in a voice high and cracking, but the priests never looked at his face. They moved with the calm precision of craftsmen, as though burying the living was no more remarkable than sealing a granary. When he was lowered into the pit, he clung to the priest's robe until his nails tore away. The old captain, who had served 3 generations of kings, was forced down next. He did not weep. He only closed his eyes and whispered a name over and over, perhaps his wife's, perhaps the name of a god who would not answer. His last breath came out as a long, ragged sigh. By the time the clay reached his chin, he was already gone. Throughout the day, the gongs tolled without pause, a ceaseless dirge. The sun climbed and sank behind the clouds, and still the burial continued. By dusk, the pits were filled, the field a lattice of pale rectangles. Torches were planted in the soft earth, their flames flickering like the last convulsions of dying hearts. When the oracle was satisfied, she turned to the priests and raised her staff once more. The final chant was offered, invoking the king's ascent into the realms beyond, escorted by his silent army of souls. As she spoke, a warm wind swept across the field, carrying with it the sour tang of clay and blood. Some among the onlookers claimed they saw a shadow detach itself from the funeral pyre within the palace, drifting out across the burial ground, a formless darkness that lingered above the sealed graves, as if tasting the air for the last cries it could not hear. Others swore they felt something pressing against the soles of their feet, a trembling that traveled up through their bones and into their chests. No one spoke of it aloud. They would pretend they had not felt it, for to confess such knowledge was to invite the dead's attention. And even the bravest among them could not bear the thought of being remembered by the earth that drank so many screams. The night did not bring relief. Long after the last pit was sealed and the last torch had guttered into smoke, the burial field seethed with a hush more suffocating than any roar. The watchers dispersed in uneasy silence, careful to keep their eyes fixed forward so as not to glimpse any phantom movement from the mounds. Only the oracle remained, her bone-beaded robe coiling around her ankles as she traced a circle in the damp clay. In that circle she left offerings, bowls of millet, folded scraps of linen, fist-sized stones etched with runes too ancient to decipher. She murmured words no living tongue spoke anymore, words that seemed to bleed out of her throat like cold tar. It was said that these utterances were not prayers but bindings, commands to anchor the newly dead to the king's spirit. The High Oracle's face, hidden behind a mask carved from the skull of her predecessor, betrayed no flicker of emotion. She had overseen this rite many times. It was not grief she felt, but an immense fatigue, the weariness of a custodian who must polish the same grim reliquary year after year. Far beneath the crust of clay, the last heat was leaching from the bodies. Those who had died swiftly were blessed. Others had clung to life for hours in darkness, lungs straining against the compressing weight. The legend held that their final exhalations turned to vapor and seeped up through the cracks, invisible as breath in winter. Even now, the oracle imagined she felt the damp on her palms, like tears, but thicker. When at last she withdrew to the temple, two young novices were left to watch over the field until dawn. They sat with their backs pressed against the low earthen embankment, torches planted on either side. Though they were brothers by blood, neither dared to speak to the other. Every creak of settling soil, every stirring of wind, felt like a summons. The elder of the two tried to recite the protection chants he'd learned as a child, but the syllables tangled in his throat. His brother only stared into the darkness, eyes wide and unblinking. He would not survive the year. Some said the burial ground's breath had stolen his wits that night, leaving him hollow as a gourd. By morning, the king's body had finally ceased its monstrous imitation of life. The heat that had lingered unnaturally in his chest guttered out. Physicians moved swiftly to bind the limbs and drain the fluids. The corpse was bathed in perfumed water infused with crushed orchid petals and fragments of rare resins. Servants dressed the body in regalia whose weight alone would have suffocated any living man. A headdress of woven gold threads, a tunic stiff with coral inlays, a necklace strung with the teeth of conquered chieftains. When he was laid upon the bier, the High Oracle emerged from her vigil and knelt beside him. Her hands, thin and brown as old parchment, brushed the king's waxy cheek. No softness stirred in her expression. In that moment she was less woman than effigy, a vessel through which duty spoke. She lifted a shallow bowl of dark liquid and tipped it over the king's lips. The potion was a final libation, a tincture of poppy, scorched honey, and the marrow of 3 white oxen, all blended to lure the spirit fully into the beyond. Some witnesses claimed the king's eyelids twitched as the black droplets slid into his mouth, but none dared to acknowledge it. The bier was borne through the eastern gate in a procession that stretched for half a mile. Drums pounded in a rhythmic cadence, each beat like the knocking of colossal fists against the sky. Petals were cast before the litter, forming a carpet that quickly turned to paste beneath the tread of 1,000 feet. At the forefront walked the High Oracle and her priests, chanting the names of every ancestor back to the dawn of the tribe. Each name was a stone laid across the king's path, ensuring he would not wander astray in death. Behind them came the bound captives' families. Their faces were hidden under thick mourning veils, but the shape of their grief was unmistakable. Bent shoulders, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles gleamed. Some trailed fingers along the edges of the pits as they passed, as if by that single touch they could call their loved ones back from the silence. Others shuffled forward with blank, glassy stares, already half consumed by the same darkness that had swallowed the buried. When the procession reached the burial field, the torches were relit and set into the ground in a vast circle. The pits themselves had hardened overnight, a crust of pale clay smoothing every contour. No trace of struggle remained, no mark of the breathless panic that had filled each cavity. If any sound still drifted up from below, it was lost in the steady drone of the priestly chorus. A platform of cedar and black lacquer had been constructed over the central grave, raised on 12 pillars carved with snarling beasts. Here, the bier was placed. The oracle climbed the platform and faced the assembly. From the folds of her robe, she drew a length of silk the color of drying blood. Its surface was embroidered with a spiral of symbols, so dense and sinuous that some said they were a map of the underworld itself. Holding the silk aloft, she intoned the final litany, the summoning of the 1,000 shadows. It was in this chant, they believed, that the dead servants were called to rise in spirit and follow their lord. Those watching felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dawn air. Some said the ground shivered, a quivering too regular to be a trick of tired senses. One of the youngest acolytes dropped his censer, the coals bursting across the clay like red insects. He was dragged away before he could speak of what he'd seen. In that moment, the king's spirit was said to stand at the threshold between realms. He would look back upon the field of sealed graves, and from each would emerge a vapor pale as dawn frost, swirling up to meet him. The legend insisted that he nodded once to each rising soul, and that they bowed in perfect unison, their devotion absolute in death, though it had faltered in life. But the spirits did not remain. They trailed after their king as he turned to walk into the darkness beyond the world, leaving only silence behind. A silence so complete that some of the onlookers began to weep because it was like the earth itself had ceased to breathe. When the oracle at last lowered her arms, the watchers were dismissed. They returned to their lives as if nothing had transpired, but all carried an echo of that morning, a memory that would surface unbidden in the deepest hours of night. Some would wake drenched in cold sweat, certain they heard muffled scratching beneath their floorboards. Others would dream of pale hands breaking through clay, reaching for them with fingers that ended in torn, dirt-clogged nails. Years passed, new kings rose and died, and the burial ground expanded pit by pit, generation upon generation. The rites never changed. Each oracle taught the next the same words, the same gestures, the same unwavering ceremony. And with every burial, the stories deepened, threads of horror woven into the fabric of the kingdom, until no one could remember a time when the earth had not been fed with living flesh. Yet in all that time, none dared to question the necessity. The kings were gods in mortal guise. To serve them in death was an honor beyond question, a sacrifice that preserved the balance of heaven and earth. Or so it was said, whispered behind calloused hands, chanted in trembling voices as the pits yawned open yet again. And in the burial field, where no grass grew and no birds dared linger, the clay continued to remember. Long after the bodies had rotted to slurry and bone, the ground remained cold to the touch. Children who strayed too near were known to fall into fits, their eyes rolling white, their mouths stretching in soundless screams. When the elders pulled them away, they would swear they'd felt hands beneath the earth, countless hands groping upward, blind and hungry. No temple was ever built over the burial ground. No monuments were raised to name those who had vanished beneath the clay. It was enough that their breath had warmed the king's journey, that their fear had salted the path he walked into the afterlife. The living understood that to mark the site too openly was to invite remembrance, and with it, retribution. So it remained, a field of unbroken pale earth, ringed by black pines whose trunks were scarred by ancient knives. And in the oldest seasons, when the rains came so heavy, the clay turned to a quagmire. Travelers swore they glimpsed faces beneath the shallow pools, eyeless, mouth agape, forever calling to those who passed by. The rains returned in the 13th year of the next king's reign. falling with such relentless ferocity that the rivers crawled beyond their banks and swallowed whole villages. The burial field became a shallow lake, its surface filmed with oily rainbows where torch soot and ancient oils bled up from the drowned clay. The elders declared it an omen, that the dead had grown restless in their prison, that their hunger had begun to seep into the world of the living. At night, watchers stationed on the embankments reported seeing shapes moving just beneath the water, drifting in slow circles around the submerged pits. Some claimed the shapes were no more than submerged tree roots or the swell of buried beams collapsing under centuries of weight. Others whispered of pale forms brushing the underside of the flood, mouths stretched in silent appeal. A few believed these apparitions were not the dead themselves, but only their memories, echoes of their terror replaying over and over, a theater of agony that could never be extinguished. When the water finally receded, it left behind a new face on the burial field. The clay had cracked open in broad fissures, revealing glimpses of the entombed beneath. A shoulder bone glinting gray, a piece of skull still daubed with cinnabar. For 3 days no one dared approach. Even the priests kept their distance, clutching their amulets and muttering prayers through clenched teeth. The high oracle, now shrunken with age and swaddled in layer upon layer of moth-eaten cloth, was carried to the field on a litter. She studied the gaping wounds in the earth without speaking. The wind tugged her veil sideways, exposing one clouded eye that seemed blind to everything except some vision no other could share. At last she raised her hand. "Seal it," she rasped, her voice dry as husks. The acolytes hesitated. To step down among those fractures was to invite 1,000 unseen fingers to seize their ankles and drag them under. But none dared refuse. They labored from dawn until dusk, hauling baskets of new clay, packing every crevice, tamping the earth with flat paddles carved with sigils of binding. As the fissures closed, the smell of the pits thickened. Sour and sweet at once, the stink of centuries of decay forced to the surface. Several of the younger men vomited as they worked. The oracle did not turn her gaze away even once. By the time the last crack was filled and smoothed, night had fallen. The workers retreated, leaving the oracle alone. She remained there until the moon rose, a bony sentinel poised above the sealed graves. Those watching from the embankments later claimed she began to sway, as if in communion with something no living eye could witness. Some said she was bargaining with the dead, promising more sacrifices if they would return to sleep. Others believed she was pleading forgiveness, but no one dared approach closely enough to hear the words she whispered into the unquiet dark. The following season brought famine. Crops withered in the fields, infants died in their mothers' arms. Traders who came from the western provinces spread rumors that the burial field had cursed the land, that no harvest would flourish until the rites were ended forever. But the king would not abandon the custom. He was young, arrogant, certain that his ancestors' hunger was a debt he alone must repay. When the oracle died in the 3rd month of the famine, he declared that the next funeral would be the most lavish of any before it, an offering so abundant that no spirit could deny its satisfaction. It came sooner than anyone expected. That winter, a fever swept through the palace, taking half the court in mere weeks. The king himself succumbed at the height of the plague, his body swelling with dark blotches until his skin split in a dozen places. No priest could interpret whether this was punishment or fulfillment. They only knew that the old rites must proceed. The new oracle, a woman scarcely past her 25th year, was consecrated the morning after the king's death. She took her vows with her eyes fixed on the burial field, and some thought she shivered as she swore to uphold every tradition. Preparations began at once. More pits were dug, so many that the embankments had to be expanded to accommodate them. 240 souls were chosen for the final sacrifice: servants, scribes, guards, dancers, children. No one was exempt. The kingdom's hunger had become a mouth too wide to close. On the night before the funeral, the captives were brought to the old temple for purification. They were stripped of all garments and possessions, their hair hacked away in ragged handfuls. Each was made to drink a draught that blurred their sight and softened their limbs. So when they were led to the pits, their cries were thin and wandering. Some staggered in circles, reaching out to touch invisible companions. Others sang scraps of lullabies from their childhoods, the words slurring together until they dissolved in tears. The oracle led the procession herself. No mask concealed her face. She walked among the doomed with the same numb composure the old oracle had worn, but those who glimpsed her eyes swore they saw nothing but terror there, a reflection of the dread that waited beneath the soil. One by one, the captives were lowered into the pits. The earth drank them as it always had. The chants rose, wrapping the night in their narcotic rhythm. But as the final pit was sealed and the priests turned away, a sudden gust tore through the field. It extinguished every torch in a single, roaring breath. The darkness that fell was absolute. Even the moon vanished behind a scrim of clouds, leaving the burial ground blank and black as a wound. For the first time in all the kingdom's generations, the chanting stopped. The priests huddled together, clutching their talismans, unable to see even their own hands. And then, from beneath their feet, rose a sound none would ever forget. It was not the groaning of settling earth. It was not the sigh of wind through grass. It was a chorus, 1,000 voices whispering in perfect unison. No language shaped their words. The sound was older than language, a tide of yearning and accusation that scraped against the mind like a blade. The new oracle fell to her knees. She pressed her palms to the clay, her face contorted in something between agony and revelation. When the torches were rekindled at last, she was still kneeling there, her lips moving silently. They carried her away before she could speak the words that had bloomed in her mouth. In the months that followed, the kingdom began to decay. Famine gave way to pestilence. The rivers turned black with rot. Children were born with clouded eyes and limp, twisted limbs. Some whispered that the final sacrifice had not sated the dead, but roused them fully, that the burial field had become a gateway no priest could close. When the oracle awoke from her stupor, her hair had turned as white as bone. She would not speak of what she had heard beneath the clay. By the next year, the kingdom's borders had begun to unravel. Outlying villages fled into the hills, abandoning their fields and shrines. The burial field lay quiet, but no one believed it was empty. At night, watchers claimed they saw pale figures standing above the pits, hundreds of them motionless, watching the palace walls. Some called them phantoms. Others believed they were the final army of the dead, waiting for the moment to reclaim what had been stolen from them. In the final record of the hung kings, the scribes wrote only this: that in the end, no offering could be large enough to fill the hunger beneath the earth. The gods who had demanded flesh were never satisfied. They consumed generation after generation, swallowing kings and peasants alike, until no difference remained between them. And so the burial field remained long after the kingdom was forgotten, after the temples crumbled and the names of rulers faded into myth. Only the earth endured, cold, pale, and patient. In the seasons when the rains came and the pits softened, travelers still claimed to see shapes stirring beneath the cracked clay. They told of hands that reached upward without end, of mouths frozen in the moment of their last plea. It is said that if you stand there at dusk, if you listen past the wind, you can hear the voices of those who were swallowed alive, whispering the same question over and over, a question no living soul has ever dared answer. Did you think you would be spared? Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.